Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director, and I'd like to welcome you all to this FF Distance Edition presentation hosted by Roberto Rovira, who is based in and around the Miami area, as he will explain. The FF series is an online reinvention of the League's in-person First Friday receptions, tours, and project reviews. Like First Fridays, these programs provide the opportunity to get a sense of the studio culture, to see where and how firms are working. And the online format also expands the scope of these events well beyond the office walls, including the chance to virtually visit project sites, and with today's more tropical location, particularly welcome on a gray winter's day. The 2021-22 series features design practices that are redefining the public landscape by responding to social and environmental concerns and exploring the intersections of architecture, technology, and ecology. Next month's session, continuing our quest for warmer and sunnier locations, we'll visit the off-site workplaces, studio, and projects of the San Antonio and Austin-based firm Lake Flato. Today's program will be introduced and moderated by Ron Henderson, who is professor and director of the Master of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism program at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. He is also founding principal of LIRIO Landscape Architecture, a senior fellow of Garden and Landscape Studies at Dumbarton Oaks, and a Japan-US Friendship Commission Creative Artist Fellow. His broad range of current research includes the Driverless City Project, Gardens and Contemporary Urbanism in China and Japan, arboriculture and horticulture practices, botanical drawing, and landscape-based urbanism. He's the author of The Gardens of Suzhou and numerous articles on landscape architecture and urbanism. Following the presentation and Ron's conversation with Roberto, the discussion will be open to all attendees, at which point we hope you will turn your cameras back on. Please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation. You can pose your questions in the chat section, and if you feel comfortable doing so, we invite you to ask them in person. Before we begin, a quick thank to the League sponsors. This program is supported in part by the New York State Council on the Arts with support from the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, as well as by the League's members, whose annual support makes all of our programs and events possible. Please visit arcleague.org for further information about membership and the League's upcoming and past programs. We have an extensive archive of videos, images, and texts. Finally, towards the end of the program, information will be posted in the chat section for those of you seeking CEUs.
Thank you, Anne and Rafi. As you can imagine, yes, I'm going to welcome from wintry Chicago. This is the lake with lots of ice on it. So yeah, definitely looking forward to hearing from tropical Miami. I also want to thank the Architectural League for this series that's highlighting landscape architects and landscape-based practices. It's really valuable for those of us who are engaged in this kind of work to be given this kind of platform, and we really appreciate it. Yeah, it's really great to be able to introduce Studio Roberto Rivera. As Anne said, Miami-based landscape art and design practice founded by Roberto Rovira, landscape architect with a design, engineering, and fine arts background, quite a range of expertise, whose projects engage the edges of the natural and construction processes. The work of the studio seeks connections and agencies through ecology and culture within an imperative to inspire the public. This studio is a maker studio, and this is something I've known for a long time, working first with Roberto at RISD, where he and other landscape architecture graduate students stayed just a step ahead of RISD security and the Providence Police as they installed ice sculptures, lawn corridors, and other guerrilla gardens in and around the campus. While I was a thesis advisor for Roberto so many years ago, he and I both know that our real teacher was Leonard Newcomb. Welcome to the Architecture League of New York's First Friday, Distance Edition with Studio Roberto Rivera. Following Roberto's presentation, I will, as Anne said, moderate a discussion perhaps asking a few nonsensical or confounding questions. Hopefully that will entertain this erudite audience. Nevertheless, I'm sure Roberto will inspire. So let us welcome Roberto Rovira.
Thank you, Ron, for that warm welcome. And thank you, Anne and Rafi and the Architectural League. It's a true pleasure to be here with you. Again, it's been a few years, but I'm extremely excited to share a little bit of the work that we're doing down here. And I first have to start by thanking my august team. I call ourselves a small group of creative overachievers, all of whom have decided to live in a place where this is a diagram of storms that are 75 miles or more in wind speed, a place known as Florida, which confounds us every day. And no logical person would ever choose to live here knowing this kind of thing. But then again, Florida is not a rational place, it seems. In particular, the place where I reside and where we have our studio is actually at this very interesting boundary where agriculture and city meet Everglades. And so much happens just above the surface. We definitely do not have the benefit of topography and mountains, but within a few feet, as you'll see, there's an incredible amount of vibrancy and activity and inspiration. And we do have these amazing skies that make up for the lack of a topography. So, of course, many things happen at that 2 to 3 foot cross section. From Whiskey, my rescue dog, to these miniature Janet Eckelman sculptures, which happen every single morning as the dew hits what looks like a metropolis of spiders. And it lights up this very thin layer of an area that I've decided to leave unmowed to see what happens. All it takes is some stopping, some observing, and I think that's something that we always strive for in our studio. If we stop and listen, we can achieve great sensitivities about what we're about to do as designers. And of course, we learned from our environment. The natural civil engineer of the alligator is a great teacher. Some of the changes that are massive and transformative in our ecosystems happen because an alligator decides to dig a hole, water seeps in from the river of grass, fish come, birds come, seeds come, and an entire ecosystem is born. And this diagram is interesting because it actually shows how the infrastructure of canals has impacted the way that the alligators nest. So there's a direct connection between how we choose to change our natural environment, of course, and how that long-term transformation of our ecosystem that is actually a macro version of what an alligator does, but perhaps with different intents. So this is actually a job site. We're sitting on limestone. You dig and you find shells. These cross sections are porous earthwork that are incredibly porous and fertile, and trees and plants just root right through it, even though it looks impenetrable. Water is just under the surface. My studio here sits about 11 feet above NGVD, which is the Rockies for Florida. And these are wells that we've dug to create places like this. This is actually a pond where we harvested the stone, we stacked it, ran water on it. We didn't plant any of these things, and all it takes is water and sun, and you have an ecosystem that is hard to put the brakes on. It lets us do things like this, which you'll hear about and see more about here shortly. But the way that living things and inanimate things interact are the foundation that defines us. And somebody like Primo here, who's very proud of his nursery, these are the people that we meet, and we find ourselves in Miami being at a crossroads of diversity unlike any other place. People wear their identity on their sleeve. And again, so much of it happens right on the surface. So I'll start with the Casa Coral. This is where the studio is. This is where I live. And you can see at any opportunity, you will have the battle of root plants coming in and seeding themselves on a rocky surface and eventually becoming something like this, which is the view that I have from the two windows that face this 1930s house just next to us. Remember this poinciana tree? I'll talk about it more down the road. But again, that thin cross section, these are experiments that I've done over the last few years, leaving 2.7 acres and selectively leaving some areas unmowed. In part, this began as a way to define, rather than put flags and string to define the building footprint where we're going to be building our studio, I decided to leave it unmowed and see what happens. And so it becomes a canvas for just observing whether it's the spiders crafting their webs or actually becoming a plinth to create elements like this. This is actually a structure that I built over the course of a couple of days with our team and with my kids, and we built this, I guess technically it's called the Hyperbolic Paraboloid, to go back to my engineering days. A very simple structure made of straight 1x2s connected with bolts. And I think throughout some of the projects that I'll share with you today, you'll see we strive to use or have an economy of means, and nevertheless make great gestures with the fewest moves possible. So this was the structure. We put it up, and within a couple of days, we found, an American kestrel just making it a place to stop. This is actually in a wildlife migratory corridor. And then the other day, as I was getting ready, I went out to film the landscape, and I was surprised as I walked past the rookery and kind of took pictures, and suddenly a rabbit comes through. And of course, we build things and the natural world comes knocking at our door. This is actually an owl. We've called him Hootie, of course, and it's always watching. It sits there. It's been there for several months, and all it does is observe us. I'm not sure who's watching who. Far in the distance, this is a common sight. We find these turkey buzzards just circling. These are important important actors in a landscape that is constantly changing. They take care of all the carrion. And so that became, I think, an inspiring sort of element. And so one of the things that we like to do is to learn from that and try to emulate that, whether it's by creating nets or in this case, building a very simple model of a bird and using that and starting to experiment with how that could become mobile, how that could, in this case, this was an experiment, perhaps a little bit too static, but eventually it became this, which is a very simple homage to this daily sight of these turkey vultures circling overhead, which might not sound like a poetic name for a bird, but they truly are remarkable. So in that cross section, as I was saying, this is left alone, and this becomes this endless canvas of possibility. And then that allows us to also experiment with objects like these large monoliths, these beautiful stones that just need a lot of room to be part of this landscape. These planters left unplanted, just because that arrangement to me communicates a certain connection to the ground. Just the geometry of these planters was very interesting to us. And to go back to the tree, about 2-3 months ago, after a storm, the tree lost one big limb, and eventually it came down within the space of a couple of days. So this would be tragic, and it was, in fact, but you become accustomed to this in the cleaning house that happens every year with hurricanes and storms. We took that, and here with one of my kids, I have 3 boys, and we used that as an opportunity to create something. We charred it, we cut it, we created a structure that we didn't know what to name it because it resembled so many things at once. So we called it bear, cat, dog, raccoon. Depending on where you're looking at, that's what it is. So that became its own object, its own sculpture. But then the actual cuts were really perfect to make a simple bench, which we used for a month or so. And that too became subject to decay, so we moved on. And it's become firewood, so now we have a fire pit, which you wouldn't think you would need that in Miami, but we do make use of it this time of year. The landscape changes. This palm didn't quite make it. I planted this alley of palm trees. And rather than just take it out, I decided to honor its end, as it were, just basically wrapping it in string, the bright magenta string in its string in its last hurrah. The alley becomes a very important formal element, but also a place for all kinds of, an infrastructure for all kinds of activities. By putting up this screen, you see just this dappled light that comes through the palm tree's fronds, and just the interaction with the surface of the screen is just something that to me is very inspiring. It reminds me of my Navy days, and just the quiet, which is quite special in this part of south of Miami. It makes this a very welcome and simple feature. And of course, that then becomes, during COVID, a surface where we projected and watched. If you know the Mexican actor Cantinflas, we watched Cantinflas movies with my 95-year-old mother-in-law, which was quite perfect use of an alley for that, an outdoor drive-in. So this is looking at the site from above, and a couple of fly-throughs that we did just to see all the pieces together. It's one of the things that I appreciate about being in this place is that it just gives us room to test ideas that are more permanent, ideas that are very temporary, but it gives us space and time to do that. And inevitably, it becomes a moment to interact with, with living things, with the living environment, with the ecologies that surround us, which I'll be talking about throughout. We have grand plans. This is what we plan to do, build a pond like the one you saw in the image, do the studio with 2 40-foot containers offset to have the office and a place to really see a living portfolio. The Hummingbird House is not 10 minutes away from where we are, and this is a project I've been working on for several years. It's the goal of this place. It's a couple who has a retreat. They want to create a wellness retreat, and so we transformed what was a sugar apple orchard, did some adjustments to the topography, carved that pond, took advantage of the trees that were there, and did things like this, which is a gate that is actually 2 gates, but because the hummingbird's wings are in different positions, when it opens, it seems as if it's fluttering. A very simple idea, and one that we were happy to be able to execute. We've completed phase 1 of this project. There's much more ahead, but it's really a pleasure to see it evolve. And things like this, just a couple of feet. This is 24-inch height to create the plinth for that large tiki hut really transforms the feeling. So just that little bit of grade in a place that's not known for topography makes a huge difference. And the Ceiba bombax, these are these flowers. This is a gigantic tree, and we put up this 13-foot Buddha on top of the waterfall. And that was a serious intake of breath as we nested it on top of it, taking chances all the time. A project that you may or may not be familiar with is actually one in our backyard. As chair and professor at Florida International University, its landscape program. This is a project that the university asked me to lead, and I recruited 4 students, transformed this brutalist courtyard into what you see here, which is a lush place for contemplation that really changes everybody's mood, especially before tests. It's actually the 2nd oldest building on campus, and it has 13,000 kids who take classes on it. But it used to be this red mulch and concrete no man's land. These nets above you work in unison with these benches that we modeled out of PVC and plywood. We used air plants that need no soil. And we use a very aggressive sky blue vine that gives us that lush perimeter. And the building operates, has four levels, offices throughout, so the experience changes no matter where you are. It just gives you a slightly different view. One bench faces in, the other bench faces out. It's the same profile. So that was a bit of an economy, but it gives a totally different experience depending on how you choose to use it. So I'll move through this quickly. But the most important thing is that the furniture here is not a standalone thing. It's actually important that to note that the section is fundamental, how the reclining benches work with this netting that is centered on the skylights above. And it continues to be one of the more popular places on campus, most photographed, very popular during graduation, etc. But most importantly, what I love about it is that we managed to create a space that is a complete moment of quiet in an otherwise, if you think of student unions, they tend to be quite cacophonous, but this place, when people walk through it, they change, the behavior changes immediately. A project that we did here just north, also using the nets, was actually a public art project funded by the Community Foundation of Broward. And what's the challenge here was that the kids who go to the school on the east side live on the west side and have to cross the only bridge that crosses the Florida Turnpike. It's a challenge because it's an extremely noisy and off-putting structure. Has a sort of a brutalist appeal, but kids go through that, notorious for getting jumped. And the city and the foundation and our proposal was to do something about it. Complicated in the sense that there's many jurisdictions, the city, Florida Power and Light, the school board, and the Department of Transportation, the FDOT, which I sometimes affectionately call the FDONT, the DONT, because they said that we couldn't touch the bridge because we would have to buy the bridge. And buying the bridge meant painting it every 8 years for $300,000. So clearly that was a non-starter. We had to come up with something else. And of course, the way to do that, as with many of our projects, is to really engage the community and build that momentum. So we had sessions where we went, we brought the kids to FIU, we visited with them, we made wish lists, we made had conversations about what they aspired their community to have and build. And we did exercises like this, and I collaborated with my colleague at FIU, Yasa Koloshinsky, an artist, former chair of the Art and Art History program. And we came up with this simple exercise where the kids from the Y in the school would have to map their trajectory from home to their place of worship to their auntie's house, and they had to do that with yarn and string. And this was an opportunity for us to get to know them, to build trust, and to engage them in what became a project that where we used over 250,000 zip ties, as you will see here shortly. So we couldn't touch the bridge. So instead, what we did is we dealt with the endpoint. So every time that they cross the bridge, they get to see these nets on both ends. So even though it's not as transformative of the bridge itself, it does create this experience that defines a daily ritual of crossing an otherwise dangerous and off-putting place. So these were some of the renderings we prepared as part of that process. And this was installation day, where graduating classes and young kids came out, and the principal made it so that the graduating class would get several thousand zip ties, and they would zip tie the chain link fence, which in itself was quite drab. So it becomes, again, part of the ritual of graduation, and again, with a simple gesture of these structures to transform their daily experience. And it was obviously a point of pride for us, for the kids, and for the city of Lauderhill. Everybody came out and celebrated this fundamental transformation. Another project that I wanted to share was a park that we did in Aruba. Aruba is just north of South America, and north of Venezuela. And Rietveld Park, because the design school that's right across this park was actually has a counterpart in the Netherlands. It was founded by Gerrit Rietveld. So as we went forward, this was actually transforming a parking area. And one of the things that we did in our visits was to really take stock of, the existing patterns. And one thing that you cannot get away from is just the prevailing winds. The trade winds always come in from the northeast, and they actually have everything to do with the morphology of the landscape. Trees that are shaped and have that cantilever because of the constant wind. The city underwent a infrastructure transformation, bringing a trolley to this older part of the town, wanting to move their tourism from the usual across the street from the cruise ships into these other parts of the city's capital. So we documented the vernacular architecture, the landscape, and in an island that is known for how hot it gets and how windy it is, shelter is extremely important. So is the patterns that we wanted to use in terms of plant material, in terms of architecture. We wanted to get a true understanding of that as we created not just a utilitarian shade structure, but something that would be defining of this place. So this is what it looked like before, and this is what we ended up doing. And our studio looked at the trade winds which come in from the northeast, as I said, and the grain of the site, all the plant material, and even the grain of the pergola follows that northeast southwest geometry. So not only is it a strategy for resilience, because if you're building in the direction of the wind, you have less resistance, but it's also a way to unify this site. There are plans to continue the project by building a waterfront, a river walk. So this is a part of that puzzle. And we use tile that you find throughout this, actually throughout the Caribbean, that is cementitious and cool to walk barefoot on, and it works indoors and outdoors. And at night we illuminated it so it becomes almost like a lantern. The Bokeh Museum is a project that we collaborated with Glavovich Studio here in Fort Lauderdale. And the premise here, I guess the challenge was, this is a museum with an excellent collection, and it's actually surrounded by significant traffic thoroughfares, but nobody knows or knew to stop because none of the entrances to the museum happen on this side, and there was very little, despite many attempts to change that. It was always a challenge to get people to access it from one side. So the strategy was to take some of the collection, which they had concentrated in a small courtyard, and to take it outside and turn the sidewalk basically into an outdoor gallery. And that's in fact what happened. That space then becomes not just a sidewalk, which you'll see what it looked like before, but actually a place to be, a place to showcase the collections, the sculptures, etc., and use a little bit of topography to make that happen. This is what it looked like before. And you would think, yes, trellis, great idea, shade, Florida. But what it does is just creates a barrier. It didn't have that sense of place. It just basically created a barrier between the public view and the museum. And so that's what this project did. And it uses native plant material, native grasses, and other plant material that will, in the long term, mean savings and maintenance, etc. Also, a CMU wall that blocks their parking, we outfitted with the vines that you see here, many different types of vines that were offset. So it really changes the impression of what the museum is and what it can be for the public. Grovile is a project that we have been also working on now for almost 5 years. This is actually a man-made island in Coconut Grove. It was the place. It has 3 towers. Quite an incredible feature of Miami. During its time. But over time, the design actually separated the users and all the folks who lived here from the water, which is the main asset of this place. Not only that, but it also had many issues with drainage. The way that a lot of these buildings were built is they built these parking decks or sculpture decks, as they were called, with a roof that was habitable. And then over time, the drainage gave out, and you get situations like this. So it's an immense liability. And we were asked to come in and design all of the sculpture decks and pool decks. And this is what we began, what the project looked like before. So a series of raised planting beds that separate the spaces into smaller spaces. And in our design, we actually introduce topography and plantings that are wind tolerant. This is right on the bay. So we have a plant palette that is on the windward side, quite durable. And then on the leeward side, away from the wind, it changes. And one of the most important things that we felt needed to happen was, historically, there was one ramp that connected this upper level to their pool deck. So it was a real missed opportunity to take advantage of this entire property, this above ground deck. So we did that with a grand stair and a grand ramp that is long enough to not even to be under 5%. And it creates a landscape is much more welcoming to leisurely walks and can get used very easily, no matter where you live in any one of these towers. The project is actually quite unique because oftentimes we think, well, the view from above, if it's a flat area, that like who will see that in any other place? But here, all of the balconies face these decks. So this is something that was first, foremost in our mind in terms of how do we create something that is of interest. It doesn't just block the views to the deck. And we continue to work on this project, but it's actually quite a transformation from where it began. I wanted to end with a project that I call the Ecological Atlas. I've been working on this project for many years, and it's about how technology and information and data science can be leveraged to help us better understand the natural world. One of my goals throughout my work, and given my background and interests, is that there is an opportunity for us to think of a moment now when we can leverage what has historically been our ability to understand the natural world through art, and combine that with technology. And if I like to think, these drawings were done in the 1600s. These were actually essential to understanding all of the explorations that were happening to the Americas. And so drawing and art became vehicles. A lot of these fruits, a lot of these flowers couldn't be brought back because the navigation was too long for them to be preserved. So a lot of that happened through artists that boarded these expeditions and came back with images like this, captivating images that in some way, perhaps, can be considered to have triggered the imaginations of more exploration and more curiosity about a part of the world that was not known. So art becomes a very powerful vehicle for that. So that, to me, is central to the goal of the Ecological Atlas. And who better than somebody like Alexander von Humboldt, who understood this, and in images like this, which basically illustrated the ecotones as it related to elevation, and height above sea level for the Himalayas, for the Andes. These are all scientifically accurate, but they are at the same time sensitive to how they are represented and how that information is conveyed. So that to me is always a standard. And my belief is that for many people to look at a landscape like this, there are some who understand it, there are some who are experts, but for the majority of people, it's somewhat inscrutable to try and grasp the complexity of a forest, for example, in this case, a South Florida coastal upland. But if that set of species could be understood and could be essentially illustrated in a way like you're seeing here, where we have taken the calendar from January to December and taken a grouping of typical Florida landscape species and illustrated their changes throughout the year. A palm doesn't change that much. Bougainvillea will have, its height of bloom, with the exception of the beginning of the really wet seasons, August through October. The grasses, they have a particular bloom time, the muhly grass, which is a native grass. So by showing this, it's helpful to not just understand one species at one time, but rather to get an understanding of an ecosystem in its totality, something which is otherwise an overwhelming thing to try to do. So as we move forward and we have been amassing, more and more information, one could think of the end goal, which is to work backward and not know anything about the landscape. And yet, if one is in Miami and it's March and something is blooming bright yellow, we can reverse engineer and go back and show that, because we understand time and geographic location, we can determine with pretty good accuracy that this is a yellow tabebuia tree. We know that it's native from Brazil, et cetera. And we can do this for any number of species. We can take flowers like we've done here and catalog 120 plus of them and start to drill down and give us the ability to understand each one of them on its own, but more importantly, how it fits into this larger picture. In this case, native Florida wildflowers cataloged alphabetically, and that same information can be taken and reorganized, in this case by bloom time, so that the vertical axis is the time axis from January to December, and species can be organized from early bloomers to late bloomers. And we hit this gradient with some plants that it doesn't matter the time of year, they always bloom. So as designers, it would be very powerful to use the power of data and data science and combine that with an understanding of ecology and ecosystems to help us, in this case, organizing them by color, if we have a preference for a certain color and a certain design, and then we can attach any number of data or metadata to them to create subsets that allow us to be more precise in how we design for more resilient landscapes, which is where the Eco Atlas is now. So this is just an image of our ongoing building of a database with data points that talk about those kinds of details, bloom times, whether they're salt tolerant, drought tolerant, et cetera. But that information can be applied here into fruit, when fruit becomes available in the market. We have cataloged butterflies to give us a sense of how they change throughout the year. We've cataloged over 350 birds. And in looking at these images, one understands migration. When you don't see the bird, they're not in this area. When you see two birds, it's mating season. And so it takes that totality of information and it gives us an intuitive sense of the dynamics of the world around us. And that can be elevated to be shown in galleries and museums, as we have had the fortune of doing. And then we can take that and organize it, not just plant material, but understand how flora and fauna relate to each other. And in particular, how they change as you get close to the coast, something which of course is extremely important for us to know here in South Florida. So one of the studies that we did in taking this data is to look at Miami-specific plants, native plants, from the set that we originally developed for Florida. And that yielded 84 flowers that are very, that do very well and grow abundantly here natively in Miami. If we were to remove those native plants that are not salt tolerant, again, thinking about storm surge and sea level rise, those 84 plants go to 31. So that becomes an opportunity for us to better and more visually understand that reality, which may be abstractly understood if I describe it and I explain, yes, if you have storm surge, you're going to have fewer plants that are going to survive. But to be able to show it graphically, that's the goal, one of the important goals of this project. So we created a series of relationship diagrams because in the case of butterflies, there are specific plants that offer ecosystem services to butterflies in their larval and caterpillar stages. So this particular plant services 6 unique different species of butterflies because they have co-evolved for thousands of years together. On the other side, nectar plants, these are plants that provide nectar for the adult butterflies, also very important. So some of these plants are, super feeders, as it were. And then we map that out so we have a complete understanding of all those relationships together. And we then did the exercise of removing for non-salt tolerant plants. So if that happens, then you can see how on the larval caterpillar, basically the stage when the butterflies depend on these specific plants, those get significantly reduced, as does the nectar plant. So it might give us an opportunity to better understand and make better decisions as to what to protect and where, if we know these impacts. And hopefully the tool like the Ecological Atlas allows us to do that well, or better than we have done. And so we've continued our research to build these visualizations, in this case, for a more extensive list of fruits, for fish, and for really any number of species can be understood this way. So with that, that's the last slide of that project. But what one of the things that in our practice we strive to do is to use these tools to take complexity and make it more intuitive, and to observe in doing that, to use that as a strategy to do the most with the least. If we have a better understanding as landscape architects of dynamics like these, then we're able to make better decisions and probably allow us to live in places that are as illogical as Florida has been for so many years. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now. Yeah. All right.
That's not fair, as I sit here in snowy, cold Chicago, to tempt us with vibrant tropical colors and plumed birds and flowering specimens and lively life in this time of the season. I see questions are already starting to roll in, and that's great, because I I do want to encourage everyone to please go ahead and drop in questions so that we can include those in our conversation, and also to I think we want a lively conversation, so don't be shy. Bring forward your questions, and let's play a game to see if we can confound Roberto with our questions. I mean, you started out with the place where you work. And I know that you've lived in many places. You've lived in California, in the Bay Area. We met in Providence. You've lived in Japan and Europe, Puerto Rico, Venezuela. And so the idea that at this point in your career, you've made a decision to find a place of several acres, and this is where you're now setting up your studio. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision and why you think it's important? And I'm speaking probably to a lot of people here on the call that are working from their offices in some studio in some building somewhere in the city. You have a much different situation in which your daily life is sited, and how does that influence your spirit and your work?
Well, one of the I think incredible things about this part of the world is that within Miami, I mean, Miami is a truly young city founded in the 1890s. Technically the city of Miami, it's very young. And so it is, grown in leaps and bounds. But we're limited, we're between the water and the Everglades. And fortunately, there's at least for now, limits on those development areas. But what it means is that within 30 minutes, I can go from if I mention Miami to anybody, immediately the beaches come to mind, probably South Beach. But the Everglades is just as close by. The Keys are not that far. The ocean and the national park known as Biscayne National Park, which is 90% marine, if not more, these are all within very close range to each other. Add that to the mix, a place which attracts even every year more and more diverse crowds from all over, communities from Latin America, from Europe, from everywhere. And it's a really fascinating place that in a way parallels a little bit what I have come to love about just in my experience. I like you said, I've had a fortune, not always by choice, although in retrospect I'm happy that that's the way it worked out. But it's a place that reflects like this incredible diversity, and diversity gets thrown around, this city, that city is diverse, this region is diverse, but here we have this concentration that's of biodiversity and cultural diversity that in itself is an incredible fountain, at least for inspiration and for complexities, again, existential threats, storms, sea level rise, all these things. So we kind of have to be very savvy, and I find that being here and being associated with the university at FIU and incredible experts and colleagues, it really gives us the challenge of our time. And one last thing, this area that we are, the tropics and the subtropics, this is where 3 of the world's 6 or 7 billion people live now, and that projection is going to only increase. So the problems and the issues that we're dealing with here are going to affect the majority of the world. So it's a good place to be from that point of view, both as a challenge, but also as an incredible opportunity to push ourselves to be creative and innovative in everything that we do.
So that notion that we know that, yes, the tropics and the subtropics are increasingly central to population growth, to ecological biodiversity, human biodiversity, language diversity. And, I don't know if it's fair to say, but there's, probably been a Northern Hemisphere bias, temperate climate bias in much of our design culture. What is the richness that people like me who have only worked pretty much in temperate climates, looking at the kind of characteristics of seasonality is much different. When you see a plant that flowers all year round, this is a radical transformation in those kind of complex natural systems. So help us get charged up to come down and join you in the tropics.
Anytime, I'd love that. I mean, if you also, one other thing that's related to that is that when you think of the seasons, obviously, the Northeast, comes to mind because you have very clear distinctions. But one of the things that I appreciate about having gone through the process of the Ecological Atlas, which, mind you, a seed for that project was born out of a feeling of complete ignorance when we moved here. I mean, I knew this landscape having grown in Puerto Rico and in Venezuela, but I didn't know it in the way that a landscape architect knows it. And you don't think of there being seasons in Florida, but looking at the dynamics as illustrated in that particular effort, it really is about stepping back and asking ourselves to be observant of the landscape and the environment in ways that we need to be in order to make better decisions. So the idea that there are no seasons in Florida, I think there are. It's just a lot more subtle, in the same way that topography is much more subtle. But even in the space of 12 inches with like vernal ponds and flooding, like you have an immense biodiversity that's just happening within within your height, essentially.
From Chicago, I certainly understand that diversity of life in a very shallow topography. We must be one of the 2 flattest large cities in the world. This studio site, you spoke at one point about the spider webs that seem to be a morning satisfaction, right? You probably grab your cup of coffee and go out and see what the spiders did last night as part of your kind of daily inspiration ritual. But you're also working with nets and chain link fences and these kinds of materials or fabrics that are able to scale to the landscape with quite a bit of resourcefulness, right? They're not the most expensive, but you can make big things. So Sky Lounge, the bridge, and other projects, you've used not a lot of material to make things at a scale that operate in the landscape. And I'm assuming you continue to experiment with this on the studio site, but can you say a little bit about how and why those kinds of materials are so important to you?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a practical answer and there's I guess a more philosophical one. Let's start with the practical one. You know, the guerrilla gardens, which I was so happy that you mentioned at the at the introduction. We were doing these, back in the mid '90s in Providence, and invading these spaces with like hundreds of Christmas trees and like it was and we didn't have any budget, no money whatsoever. So we were appropriating leaf litter, in the very organized New England way that gets, collected in, beautifully large, craft paper bags, or the Christmas trees that on the calendar, like on the 2nd of January get put out. So these things are available to us. And I joke that, there's for-profit, there's nonprofit, and there's negative profit enterprises. The installations fall into the negative profit rate. So the idea that you can be efficient with the minimal amount of material is actually philosophically, to me, a very fascinating one, because if you can do that, then you're able to use your energy and your resources just to look at it just in that objective sense in other things. Actually, recently in a class just yesterday, somebody mentioned and I'm not sure, maybe Ron, but the definition of beauty as being something that you cannot take anything away and you cannot add anything. It's there, right? So that economy of means, doing the most with the least, is speaking or striving towards that. And I find that inevitably means working in many layers, working in in something that is there but not there. To me, that's always been a source of fascination. Something that you're aware peripherally, that there's something about it that just draws you, and then you turn and you understand it and you see it, but it's there but it's not there. To me, if a landscape achieves that, whether it is things that you notice in the choices that you make in terms of the types of plants and when they bloom, or the types of finishes, etc. I love the challenge to do that, because again, it's kind of teetering on this becoming sort of kind of existing and non-existing. And if we think of landscape architecture as kind of working with living things, inanimate things, then that experiment lets us kind of enter into this awareness, like noticing the spider webs. And you're right, I go out there in the mornings whenever I can, because it's an incredible satisfaction. That's an economy of means, if there ever was one.
So something like the side of your studio, or something like the bridge, where there is, well, the site is acting, and you observe it, you participate in it. Clearly you document it, you map it, you map the winds, you're doing Ecological Atlas. So the site is acting, and you, as a landscape architect, designer, artist, somehow get invited, or invite yourself to act on a site that hosts your work, right? The site is a kind of host. And those actions for you are often quite resourceful, even kind of light-handed, in terms of the transformation of the experience on the site is often as simple as zip ties. It's as immediate and familiar to the public as going to Home Depot, frankly, right? And that familiarity, I think, is a way of connecting in a way where people are confounded by the transformation that's possible with such efficient means. And with, working with a team of constituents and collaborators to understand how effective a transformation of a place can be, just with people and a few materials. And so that kind of likeness of intervention in a site, but achieving such a powerful transformation seems to be something you are having some success doing. That I think those of us who are often seeking more resources to be able to achieve what we want to achieve can find lessons from you in kind of how to use these materials in a way that can amplify your work.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I think it's true that there is agency and simplicity. The way that the Lauderhill nets, the shade structures worked, is that, and this is true for landscape too, as I think you know very well, we get engaged, we get invited, as you say. I like that idea. And I sometimes say, like we should take a Hippocratic oath, right, for a landscape. First, do no harm. It's so easy to go in there. We have the means, to go in there and make massive transformations born out of conviction and not necessarily born out of humility. And there's this constant balance. I mean, there's nothing humble about a bold landscape, and I love them. It's kind of like this kind of Roman identity. Like, there is a hill, we will take it down, we will build an amphitheater, and so it shall be. And so there's power there. And in a way, I felt I studied engineering for my undergrad. I sensed that. I felt that we have these tools that allow us to do that. That we should do it, that's a different question, a much harder question. That we can do it, absolutely. But that's the easiest path. So by having something that's simple, there's agency there in that project in particular, because we started out with the nets, we incorporated the chain link fence, and a zip tie is a zip tie. Like, a school budget can handle zip ties. And that simplicity means that it doesn't require my involvement, our involvement, my collaborator Jacek and I, to go back. I mean, we're happy to go back, but if it's hopefully done in a way that allows for that simplicity to take place, then I'm happy with that. I don't need to be involved. And it gives me great pleasure to know that some kids who maybe never thought that they could transform their schoolyard that way now see that, a chain link with zip ties looks a whole lot more interesting than one without it.
I think we've got a few more minutes before we're asked to specifically bring in audience questions. So I just want to remind everyone listening in, please, please, please add questions into the chat. I see a few starting to appear again. So please engage the chat. And I think as I'm seeing some of the questions in the chat, or the discussion in the chat, are growing out of everyone seeing the Ecological Atlas. Something that I've seen parts of it over several years, but there was a moment today, Roberto, where you picked the tababuia off of that incredible obsessive inventory of plants and seasons and color, which I know is a compulsion of yours, that brings great satisfaction and motivates you. But I'd never seen where you could pick that plant and then zoom in and get the plant sheet, so to speak, and gain more information about that. And to me, that was remarkable. because I know when we're trying to teach plants, when we're, as I do, when we're trying to talk to colleagues or constituents about plants, it's very difficult to convey the general characteristics of a species, but also knowing that within that species, there's this one specimen that you should see because it has these special characteristics, or the branching is so incredible and it's different than the species, it's that plant. And that plant has a particular place in the world. The ability of the Ecological Atlas to zoom in and zoom out, to go from catalog to inventory to encyclopedia. I mean, I can see that you've done this because I know you. Working through modes of representation. And you said that the motivation for that was in part ignorance, right? You just said, I didn't know. So the way that you learn is this very precise, even complicated process of mapping, inventorying, cataloging. Can you say a little bit about that as a method of learning for someone in practice?
Yeah, I think that it's very easy to be complex. It's like the path of least resistance is just be complex. There you go. You understand it, like you deal. And I feel like the Atlas is a way to kind of break that down. If I were to think of an analogy, like if I'm trying to get home from work, I don't need the space shuttle. I don't need the complexity of this vessel with all kinds of things and buttons and switches. I could probably walk, I could use a bicycle, whatever. But it can be as complex as a space shuttle if you want it to be. And I think as a modality, I want to be able to have that.
Spoken like a true engineer, I'm thinking.
I suppose, yeah. But I don't for me as an educator, I really value how you can use a tool like that to get young kids or older kids or elderly, whatever, excited about being able to look at your environment and almost have this superpower. This is like the DNA of your environment. And you can appreciate it just as art if you wish. But if I want to know specifically what butterflies are affected if this plant is not going to make it, or if I plant this, what will that unchain? That to me is the most exciting thing too, because that's like this iceberg of information and knowledge and hopefully wisdom that you can pull from, and you can use it if you want, but you don't have to. I think that to me is like the promise of the project.
So while we're talking a little bit about the Ecological Atlas, I'm going to begin to bring in some of the chat questions. And there's kind of three that have already popped up about the Atlas that I'll go ahead and just kind of ask all three of them. Inez asked, how is all of this information being generated? Tim asked, who's paying for this work? I think the answer to this is it's the third model of profitability, I'm suspecting. And then, of course, how might this become publicly available? I'm thinking about, those on the, listening in right now are in offices, maybe many of them. And, I know in my office, we have our own forms, we have our own libraries of, digital, plants, and we develop within our own studios and our own work, our own kind of library of things that we find useful out of need. Very few people that I know have gone to the extent that you have with the Ecological Atlas to build a resource for yourself in your practice. And so I think these are really good questions. How is this information generated? How does that work within kind of idea of financial resources? And then, is this something that's going to be able to be shared in a way that we can stand on the shoulders of your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do not want it to be for myself. I think that's in the same way, Ron, that you describe having your own library and your own methodology for collecting this information. That times thousands of offices and practitioners. We know we all do this, right? So really my aspiration is that it becomes a tool that is open source, that allows anybody to contribute to it. And part of my life's work is to hopefully build that infrastructure to be able to absorb all of these individual efforts. For many reasons. I mean, obviously for the practical reasons, but also because by contributing and becoming engaged in something like that, it pulls that string, it pulls us all a little closer to that larger goal, which is observation, understanding, and agency, right? In our role as designers. Or the public for that matter, right? It could be an incredible educational tool. So where does it go, and where does the information come from? Well, we have done a lot of legwork, and we're focused on South Florida, but really the goal is that it's truly scalable. I mean, plant databases, Kew Gardens has a huge one. The USDA has a huge one. They're not, and this is where collaborations with data scientists, which I've had conversations, but nothing in earnest. That's the biggest challenge with this project is that for it to rise to the level of its promise, it requires a significant amount of upfront investment so that you have the database that you can draw from. Just to have a database of South Florida is great for this area, but it's not enough. So that's ongoing. I mean, in the project, I mean, I have gotten some very small funding, but really just to exhibit the work. It's gotten recognition, yes. I mean, Fast Company picked it a couple of times as a world-changing idea, but the funding that's required has to come from, like grants and a much larger or private investment, things like that. Things that private investment I've tried. Because it's such a long-term investment, it's hard, I think, for people to realize the return, or at least be willing to stick it out. So, so funding is obviously a little bit of a challenge always. But we've managed to get the data from these databases ourselves, and we've done some automation to make the visualizations easier. But really where it needs to be is automating the process of pulling the right data in the right format from the right place, so that it's not as I describe it, an artisanal process. It shouldn't be. I think the front end and what it can do, I'm kind of feel better that this is what the promise is, but really it has to work, and it has to be a very broad range. So I'm looking forward to reaching out to my designer colleagues to contribute to this when ready, and that's going to be the next big chapter, the 2.0 of the Eco Atlas.
And I find it really valuable that you, as you were leading into the discussion on the Atlas, showing botanical drawings from the 17th, 18th century, and the way that, again, it was knowledge grown out of ignorance, right? We didn't know what this was. The first thing we need to do is just simply document it so we know we have it. In that process of drawing, the botanical artists are learning, of course. I teach plants, plants and design, and one of the assignments, investigations, I hate the word assignments, one of the investigations that our students are asked to do is I ask them to draw a 21st century botanical drawing, because I want them to explore climate change, the emerald ash borer, fire, the kind of global contemporary issues around plant migration, plant health, within the context of thinking of how maybe historically we explored botanical knowledge of plants in one way. So the Ecological Atlas for me points to this growth in the way that we're thinking about plants, not as a specimen, but as a network, right? It's this kind of shift from object to system that, I know is a shift in ecological thinking, right? So I think there's, I think one of the questions here from Byrne was sort of how to teach subtlety and simplicity within this complex system. And I think for me, the 21st century botanical drawing is one of those devices that I try and use. How do you use the Ecological Atlas, because you are a teacher, you're chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. How do you use that, or do you use that in your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I often will use it as a way to communicate how do you interpret information and make, reading, like, I talk about Edward Tufte's work and, folks that have kind of made a career out of making that information accessible and intuitive. And I talk about the Ecological Atlas as part of our way to do analysis and inventory. And in the courses that I teach, kind of using not, in studio, yes, but also like more technical, computer practices and digital, not as a spatial design tool, but as an information tool. How do you take that information? So I use that as an example of how that can be done. And that's really interesting, the 21st century botanical drawing. And it's true, it's about, I think that having a sense of that system is really the critical part of all of this. Because again, it's just too easy to silo these individual things. And when you realize that there's these interdependencies, that's what is kind of like the epiphany. And I think also kind of in the background, I also think of, there's a lot of romance in those 16th, 17th, 18th century, illustrations. How can you not, fall in love when you see these things? They're just incredible. Or you look at Audubon's work and things like that. But as we push forward with technology, I think we always have to remind ourselves that the reason why those things are captivating today, hundreds of years later, is because of that quality that's a little bit hard to define. So it's really important to not lose the poetics in exchange for the efficiencies that technology and engineering gives us. I think maintaining that is really fundamental, because otherwise it becomes the realm of experts who are gurus at the technology and will completely disassociate the connection to this other qualitative romantic sense of the landscape as something that it can be inspiring, you know. So as much as I love, and I have built my, you know, part of my career on using technology to understand and act upon landscapes, it's really it's always something that I worry about, that we don't want to overplay that hand. We want to maintain this kind of ability to deal with the intangibles in the way that some of those illustrations are able to do even today.
We have a comment and a little bit of a question from Eleanor, who seems to be in Miami, and a high school student. And first of all, kudos to everybody who has opened up this conversation in a way that such a wide range of people are able to join. I know we are Zoom weary at this point, but what's remarkable, I think, about the platform is this kind of group of people being able to come together with fairly small effort. I say that although Anne and Rafi and everyone at the Architecture League has quietly in the background been doing a lot of work. But for all of us, it was fairly easy to simply jump in and join the Zoom and hear this and see Roberto's great work. So I know Eleanor wants to know if there are opportunities for students to visit or learn more. And now I'm beginning to imagine you beginning to host people on your site, maybe even beginning to utilize some of the strategies that you've been using in the public to maybe even help build your own site. Is that a kind of laboratory that you and everyone in the studio and your family kind of become this place?
I think so. I mean, I don't think I ever asked for permission. I think that also runs across a lot of my work. You ask for forgiveness and not for permission.
This is rule number one. I know this with Roberto. Rule number one is do not ask permission.
Right. So so my kids are begrudgingly like recruited. And it gets harder and harder. They get, sort of savvier when I come up with an idea, but they come around and it's great. I mean, it's really awesome to be in a place that lets us do that. And we are, within like a 5-minute walk of like these amazing nurseries, fruit orchards, that's really excellent. And yet, 30 minutes away from downtown. Well, 45 from downtown, 30 from the university. But I'm so happy to hear from Eleanor. At Dash, actually, one of my kids graduated from design and architecture senior high in Miami. It's an excellent school, and I was there like 2 weeks ago, actually interviewing students. So I'd love to, Eleanor, reach out to me, and I'll put my email on the chat. And then happy to host some Dash students or any other student for that matter. Because I think really if the younger that we get to this sort of awareness and effort and involvement, I think the better off we will be. So really happy that you're joining as a high school student from Miami.
And maybe the last question, and it's tied a little bit to that. Tim has asked, do you have clients who have simply invited you onto a site or onto their site to engage in this kind of long-term exploration of kind of pulling out qualities of the site? I know, we I know you and I know several projects where people have been engaged in the same site for 20 or 30 years. And there's something incredibly rewarding about being invited to be a part of that process. So apart from you, having your own site now, maybe where you're, in some ways, you become part of that that kind of sensibility. Are you engaged in any long-term explorations on a site over, over, that are starting or that maybe have happened very recently?
Well, fortunately, the Hummingbird House project and the clients who are fantastic, wonderful people, they just purchased another very large property immediately adjacent to it. So we have been engaged in doing that. And the Hummingbird House, interestingly, began, in a typical way with a typical project, but because we have been modifying and working and doing things, like the direction has changed and it has been extremely collaborative. And so this new site continues to add to that footprint. So I see that as an example of a project like you're talking about. And it's really special to be able to be in a position to do that. So I'm very grateful for that.
And I'm going to jump in here because we've hit 1:30.
Thank you, Anne. Yes.
It's been amazing. I'd like to thank both of you, Ron, for the questions that really deeply probed the history, conceptual framework, and materials of this work, and Roberto for sharing your own living laboratory. I mean, the grounds for experience and experimentation, your work, and the incredibly extensively diagrammed and beautifully illustrated Ecological Atlas that provides such a clear analysis of the inextricable relationship between wildlife and the natural landscape, including the sobering implications for the future in this era of the fluctuations in the landscape attributable to climate change. It's given us new tools for thinking about the natural and constructed environment, certainly. And one thing I'd like you to think about, someone who was talking about on-site landscape workshops, is if you look to the study, build, design, study precedent of the GHOST project that Brian McKay Lyons runs up in Nova Scotia, where he invites a few architects and then a group of people up to make a structure each year. That might point towards something. We're all deeply wanting to visit the landscape of your investigation, like now.
In February especially.
In February especially. But yeah, August maybe not so much. If there are a few questions, I think we got to all of them, but we're saving the questions. If there's something we didn't get to, we will try and get to Roberto and add those answers to the video that we will be publishing on the website. So you'll have a chance to watch this all again sometime too. And thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you, Architectural League, Rafi, for behind the scenes work, and everybody at Architectural League, and Ron. It's always wonderful to have conversations with you, and I look forward to many, many more. Take care, everybody.